Well, Angeli, thank you. And thanks to the Asia Society and Sky and Princeton for their help, Rory here as well, for inviting me to moderate today's event for the collaborations to talk about China's ideological spectrum and public opinion. And so we're going to look today at issues that are critical not only to Chinese domestic politics, but also to China's role in the world. The bromance between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, their February 4th joint statement, what is happening right now in Ukraine, the political durability of strong ties between Russia and China, the possibility of a broader conflict with the West, all may be affected by ideological and public opinion trends in China. So this is a very timely panel that we're having today. It's not simply academic research. It is directly relevant to what is on the front pages and on the screens that you watch, whether on your phone or television set. I'm going to introduce Jen and Rory in just a second. I'm going to give them about 9 to 10 minutes each to share some of the top line highlights of their research. I'm then going to ask a couple questions to fuel the fire, and then we'll open things up to questions from the rest of the audience, which you can contribute using Zoom's Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And the harder the questions, the better. No, we need softballs, easy questions. No, we want to hear any and all good questions. Let me introduce our rock star experts, both really fantastic. First, Jen Pan is Associate Professor of Communication at Stanford University. Her research focuses on political communication and authoritarian politics. She uses experimental and computational methods with large-scale data sets on political activity in China and other authoritarian regimes to answer questions about how autocrats perpetuate their rule. She looks at political censorship, propaganda, information manipulation in the digital age, how preferences and behaviors are shaped as a result. And she is author, most recently, of Welfare for Autocrats, How Social Assistance in China Cares for Its Rulers. And she's published articles in every top political science journal out there. It'd take me too long to list all of them. And on the foundation of her fantastic work, CSIS has collaborated with Sky and just published a feature highlighting the work of Jen and her regular research collaborator, Yiqing Xu, about ideological trends and public opinion in China. And you can find that feature on the CSIS website. Rory Truex, joining us today from Philadelphia, I believe. He's an assistant professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. His research focuses on Chinese politics and authoritarian systems. Again, he is published in every top poli-sci journal out there, as well as had his work featured in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. In 2021, he received the President's Award for Distinguished Teaching, the highest teaching honor at Princeton. He's also done some excellent work on China experts and how we navigate the challenges of doing research on authoritarian systems that really don't want us to do work on studying them. But we're persevering regardless through the work of both of them, and his efforts and that of all China experts are deeply appreciated by the rest of us. So what I want to do now is turn things over to both of them, starting with Jen first, and then Rory, to share the top line highlights of their research, and then we'll go from there. So Jen, thank you for joining us today. Thanks for all your fabulous work, and look forward to your comments.
Thanks, Scott, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. The aspect of my research that I'm going to focus on revolves around this question of whether people living in China have coherent belief systems, what we also call ideology. So what do I mean by a coherent belief system? We consider two main factors. First is, do certain preferences cluster together in a predictable way? So let's say you have someone who supports laissez-faire economic policies like private ownership of land. We would then say this person's preferences are predictable if they also oppose state ownership of firms. But if they support private ownership of land on one hand, but support state ownership of firms, we would then say their preferences are less predictable. So that's the first element, are preferences clustering together. The second is whether preferences are stable. And so that means if I ask someone if they supported private ownership a month ago, they should say the same thing today. And these two factors together, you have coherent beliefs if the preferences cluster together in a predictable way, and those preferences are stable over time. We're also interested in the structure of those clusters, specifically whether preferences reduce to a one-dimensional left-right scale. And we would say preferences reduce if people who hold a particular view on one set of issues, let's say economic issues, they tend to support positions like lower tax rates. Preferences would be one-dimensional if they also, people who hold that view on economic policy, hold similar view in another issue area. For example, social policies, they tend to oppose positions such as same-sex marriage. So in the US, we often think about a one-dimensional liberal conservative scale. In a country like China, we might ask whether there is a one-dimensional pro-anti-regime scale. So I want to share three key results from this research, maybe four. The first is that we find people who live in urban China do have a coherent belief system. So they do have ideology, and there are clusters of preferences in three areas. The first is around political institutions. The second is attitudes toward the economy. And the third are preferences around nationalism. And so what this means is that there are people living in China who prefer more liberal political institutions and those who prefer the status quo of authoritarian rule. There are those who prefer free market policies and those who want more state intervention in the economy. And finally, there are those who support nationalistic policies and those who do not. Second, we find some correlation between these clusters, and I'm going to show you a figure which plots on two dimensions against each other. So in the left plot, you see the correlation, positive correlation between political liberalism and pro-market views. So those who are more politically liberal also support free market policies. The second figure in the center, this is a negative correlation between political liberalism and nationalism. So those who are more politically liberal are also less nationalistic. And the final figure on the right shows this negative correlation between free market views and nationalism. So we see this correlation, but it's important to note that preferences don't reduce to a one-dimensional pro-anti-regime scale. It means that while people who are more politically liberal tend on average to support more pro-market policies, there are still plenty of people in China who support the current political system, but favor pro-market economic policies. Another thing that we find is that these preferences are stable over time. When we ask respondents the same questions over up to a year in time, they answer in similar ways. Another key result is that we find respondents who have higher incomes and higher levels of education are more likely than those with lower incomes and education to hold views that are more politically liberal and pro-market. So on the figure on the left, you see these four income brackets, higher incomes on top, and those with higher incomes are on average more supportive of political liberalism. You see something similar on the right, but this is for pro-market preferences. Again, those with higher monthly incomes are more supportive of free market policies. We've also considered, so everything I've shown you today is among an urban Chinese population. We've also done something similar among college students, both in China and in the US. And in this set of figures, the preferences of students in China are in light red, and those of students in the US are in light blue. The first column is about political liberalism. And students, and what you can see is that stronger preferences for political liberalism are toward the right of this figure. Stronger preferences for the status quo authoritarian rule is on the left. And Chinese students who study in the US are on average more politically liberal than those at top universities in China. The second set of columns are preferences related to the economy, with those who are more pro-free market on the right, those who support more state intervention on the left. And again, Chinese students who study in the US are much more supportive of free market policies than students in China. And the last column here is about nationalism. And this figure, those who are more nationalistic are on the right side, and those who are less nationalistic are on the left. And what you see here is that students at top universities in China are much more nationalistic than Chinese students studying in the US. I should also know that these figures show stability of preferences over time. All the figures on the top were taken pre-COVID in 2019. And then the second row of figures were from survey data post-COVID in the fall of 2020. So those are some of the top line findings. And I want to just say a quick word about our data and methods. The general population survey, whose results I showed you first, that's based on online survey samples. And what that means is most of our respondents are from urban China. So what we're showing today is really about urban China, less about rural China. We use a quota sampling strategy. So we set quotas for gender, age, education level, and geography so that we have a diverse sample. But our sample, we would not say, is representative of the entire Chinese population. And finally, I just want to acknowledge there's always a possibility that respondents are not revealing their true beliefs. We address this by asking multiple questions in each issue area and asking for views on very specific policies that are not politically sensitive. And I think the fact that we find a wide range of beliefs among respondents, including views that deviate from the positions of the regime, give us some confidence in the reliability of the approach. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Jen. That's extremely helpful and thoughtful. Let's turn to Rory now, who's used a little bit of a different strategy, some methods similar, but also sort of a different perspective to analyze some of the same questions. So Rory, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Scott, for the introduction, and thanks to Jen for her comments and her research, which is always inspiring to me. I wanted to start by getting a little bit into the weeds of how survey research in China works and some of the issues that we need to be on the lookout for. And this is what Jen just alluded to in her final comment, which is anytime you ask citizens in an authoritarian country how they feel about their government or their political preferences, survey researchers, we always need to be on the lookout for what we would call self-censorship, or a more jargony term would be preference falsification. The idea that people are unwilling to say how they really feel. And that might be because they don't know how they really feel about a given issue, or more concerning would be that they're simply scared to say how they really feel. And so one project I've been involved in with one of my graduate students, Xiao Shen, is to look at how Chinese citizens take surveys relative to people around the world. And one thing we can look at to get an assessment of sensitivity of different questions is how frequently people say don't know. So if you're scared to reveal your preferences on a survey, one default kind of safe approach would be to say, I don't know, or no answer. And so what Xiao and I did in one project called In Search of Self-Censorship is we look at don't know and no answer rates across the world for different populations. And we observe a few things. The first is that in general, citizens in authoritarian countries express high levels of satisfaction with their government. That's especially true in China. Chinese citizens on surveys express the highest levels of satisfaction with their government in any other country than, I believe, Vietnam is the only other country with higher rates. Another thing we observe that across the authoritarian world, in general, these questions actually don't seem to be all that sensitive. So people don't say don't know or no answer at unusually high rates. The one exception is actually China, where item non-response rates, kind of that don't know, no answer response, is quite common. And so this is just a concern that we all share as researchers, and I think it's something we should always flag when we do these types of projects. And there are ways around this. One of the things that we show in our project is that we can identify different subpopulations, people that seem particularly nervous when taking surveys. And in China, it tends to be people from marginalized groups. So people who are older, who are not members of the Communist Party. Women are more likely to say they don't know, people from rural areas, and minority groups. And so it's people who are sort of less embedded and less socialized in the political system that are more reticent. And I think that's worth noting. It also depends on the format of the survey and how you ask the questions. And so online surveys tend to be less sensitive than face-to-face surveys, and urban surveys tend to be less sensitive than rural surveys. And the types of questions Jen asked and Jen and Yiqing asked in their surveys or they're asking direct policy questions, those tend to be less sensitive as well. So this is all a long way of saying that we should be a little bit concerned about self-censorship and wariness when people take surveys, but there are ways around it and ways to learn things from data. And I would say Jen and Yiqing, as always, have done a really careful job thinking about that. The other thing I wanted to highlight today, just in my comments briefly, is another project where I also look at the determinants of political attitudes in China. So Jen was commenting about how political liberalism and other factors are related to income and education. One thing I look at in a project is personality level variables. And so in the US context, there's a lot of research that shows that personality traits, which are stable across a person's life course, are well correlated with political attitudes. But prior to this project, there wasn't really a lot of information about how personality variables and personality factors are related to political attitudes in China. And one of the things I was trying to answer with this project is, well, what type of person becomes politically discontent in China today? And prior to starting the project, I had this sort of conception of what a discontented citizen in China might look like. And I guess the way to summarize it would be sort of the vision of the enlightened discontent. So this is someone who's courageous and bold and inquisitive, seeking counter-attitudinal information, leaping across the Great Firewall, doing that sort of behavior. And in fact, what we observe with the data is that, according to what I can see, the discontented citizen in China today actually looks quite a lot different, and they more closely resemble what I would call like an isolated discontent model. So in terms of personality traits, and again, this is speaking in averages, China's most discontented citizens are highly anxious. They're highly fearful people. They're very introverted. They don't have a lot of social self-esteem. They also are not particularly inquisitive or intellectual people. And perhaps most importantly, they're what we would call highly disagreeable people. They're people who don't really care what other people think about them and are willing to get in disagreements with people. And so this is, again, not speaking of all citizens that are discontent. This is in terms of averages. But I think it's important to note that the implication of this finding is that discontent in China today is relegated to the social margins. Another thing we can show in our data is what party members look like, what members of the CCP look like in terms of their personality profiles. And the way to kind of summarize this finding, and I say this with great fondness for my own students, is that the average CCP member in China today has the personality profile of a Princeton undergraduate. They're very conscientious people, hardworking, highly extroverted, highly confident, highly inquisitive, and intellectual, in fact. And so these are personality traits that we know from the social psych literature that are correlated with success. And so I think the implication here is clear that there is a certain social dominance to the regime that manifests itself in the kind of societal structure of regime support. So I'll close my comments there. And I appreciate the invitation to share some of these findings, and I look forward to our discussion.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Rory. Super duper interesting. And I really think folks ought to go read the original research, but let's delve a little bit more here and then see where we go. And for those who are joining us today, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to add questions to this conversation, and we'll get to them. Let me begin with a couple questions for both of you. I think your research will respond in slightly different ways to this. I'm just curious about how you think about these. So the first question is, if folks in China don't have non-official sources of news, if they get educated in state-run schools, if they don't have a chance to talk to each other about sensitive issues because it's dangerous to do so, if they aren't polled and they're not asked to form preferences about important issues, if they don't have to vote about these things, how do you get stable views over time? What accounts for the formation of political views in the first place, that aren't simply a reflection of what they are being fed by the system? That's my first question. So I think people are wondering, like, where do these ideas come from in the first place? Is it, they got a transistor radio, they're listening to VOA, or how do people get a variety of views? And maybe it's personality, or maybe it's something else. The second is, both of you described variation across the community, across Chinese. You don't say it's representative or not based on the type of surveys you've done. And so I was just wondering, what would we need to do to not just talk about the variation of opinion, but the distribution of the opinion? Because one thing that comes up in the work of both of you is you do find that variety of opinion is not put the Communist Party's rule in jeopardy, right? That you can have a diversity of views, even some liberal views, and it's not threatening regime stability. And Rory has said that it's all those extroverts who are socially active and dominant in society who are also party members. But isn't it possible that if the distribution of views were of one sort or another, that your findings might actually translate into something that might make the leadership more anxious about their hold on power? Let me start with sort of those first two questions. I got one other, and then I'll be going to the Q&A as well. So why don't we start with Jen and then Rory?
Okay, those are great questions. Thanks, Scott. So on the first one, what we find in the college student sample is that students who come to the US are already much more politically liberal and supportive of free market policies, less nationalistic. So something is happening prior to college, even though we often think of college as a very formative time. So what could be those sources? It could be from family, from their local communities. And I think there's something to note, which is, even if you don't have exposure to non-official sources of news, it's still the case that in your day-to-day life, you will encounter different situations and experience policy because of the things that you encounter on a day-to-day basis. That might manifest more in terms of economic policy, preferences on economic policy, and preferences on policies related to nationalism. On the political side, and this is something that is changing, but still now in Chinese universities, there are informal study groups of students that look at, read Western political philosophers, and try to understand different types of regimes and governance systems. So even if I would say many people don't have access to non-official sources of news. They're educated, like Scott said, in state-run schools. They not only can't talk about sensitive issues, they often don't know about them in the first place. But still, in living in China and in going about your daily life, you will run into circumstances that link to policies and different types of policies. And I think that might be one factor in which the people that we are surveying are forming their views, in addition to things that are happening with intergenerational transfer of preferences. Okay, on the second question of, do we need to talk about distribution of opinion? I think there is a need to look at the distribution of opinion. And then the question there is methodological. How can we get a representative sample? But on the other hand, based on the way we're studying ideology, the fact that we find that ideology is multidimensional, it actually in some ways makes understanding that distribution potentially less crucial. So we find that preferences on political institutions, economic policy, and nationalism are correlated, but they are not one-dimensional. So that means the rule of the party is not in jeopardy. There's no anti-regime set of views. But it also means that the actions of the regime are constrained because there is not a one-dimensional alignment. So what that means is, let's say the regime adopts a protectionist economic policy. So that's going to upset people on those who hold strong free market views, and it's not going to fully satisfy those who are super nationalistic. So this multidimensionality in some ways it means there's no anti-regime set of viewpoints, but it does constrain the regime in of itself.
So I will add my 2 cents to those important questions. So in terms of kind of where do preferences come from, and given the political environment in China, why do we observe variation? I would say a few things. The first is, I think it's important to remember that even though there is always an official party line, there is a broad range of acceptable views within the party state in China. And a lot of party ideology is actually quite confusing to people. And if you look at Xi Jinping thought in particular, right, it's an amalgamation of a lot of different ideological concepts that the party has introduced over the years. And so I would say even within the Chinese political discourse, whether you're sort of more pro-market or pro-state intervention in the economy, there is variation even within China's political education system about the relative weight of those views. Perhaps that is changing over time, and I think with the increasing emphasis on Xi Jinping thought, perhaps we will see a convergence over time. And I think it'd be interesting if Jen and Yiqing, what will happen when we replicate their work in 5 or 10 years? Will we observe a different distribution? I think that's an open question, but I think it's important to remember that even within the party discourse, there's always a little bit of room for different points of view, especially on things related to the economy and society, perhaps less so with respect to nationalism in the political system. The second thing I wanted to note is that political education does matter. I've done some research on political education, and what you observe in public opinion data is that Chinese citizens quite frequently will mirror what they've been taught. So when they're asked about the word democracy, they will recite the party definition of kind of socialist democracy quite quickly. And so political education does permeate into citizens' thinking. And one thing that I think we can explore more in detail is to what extent does exposure to that really change beliefs. There's been some research that it suggests it does. So I do think kind of one's educational experience, to go to Jen and Yiqing's research, I think that does matter. But I wanted to second Jen's point about experience. And I've done some research with Chinese dissidents. And these are people that are choosing to reject the system. So I think the default in China today, as it is everywhere, is to engage in what Jost would call system justification. So there's a natural human tendency to go along with the system you're in and believe that it is just and appropriate. But in China, as in elsewhere, there are people that come to reject that. And what I've observed in working with those people is that it is sort of an accumulation of grievances that sets people down a path where they can no longer fake it. Living in a state where you're pretending to support a system that you secretly loathe is actually quite painful. And so it might be that your property was confiscated, or that your social media account was deleted, or that you are close with the Uyghur population, whatever it is. But there is a cost to the repression in China and censorship, and it does, I think, have a weight on political attitudes and public opinion. I think that's something we as social scientists can do a better job studying and teasing out. But I do think those sorts of experiences matter quite a bit. Finally, in terms of your broader question about the regime worrying about how much should we be worried about the distribution of public opinion, and how much is the regime thinking about this, I would just bring out 1 or 2 insights from some of our research that might be helpful for people to think about. The first is that we do know that the Chinese government cares a lot about public opinion, right? So there's often this narrative that the regime can do whatever it wants. It can manipulate public opinion at will. There's a whole brand of scholarship, and Jen is a leader in this area, about responsive authoritarianism, the broader idea being that the CCP regime is trying its best in many dimensions to cater to public opinion and appear responsive. So it's not the case that public opinion in China today can simply be ignored. And that's part of the reason why Jen and Yiqing's findings are really important, because it does suggest that there is a constraint as to what the regime can do, especially with respect to foreign policy, which I'm sure we'll talk about more. And then the second thing I wanted to note is that what we know in democratic settings is that not all people's voices matter the same. And in democracies, it tends to be the wealthy and the outspoken that have a disproportionate influence on politics. And I think we have yet to kind of articulate the same insight for the Chinese political context. But given what I found in my own research, that certain types of people are more reticent to say anything, it may very well be the case that those types of people are underrepresented systematically in the Chinese system and in the Chinese political discourse. And so I think it's important to remember that not all opinions are treated equally or matter equally, certainly in a place like China. And this is what's known as the silent voices problem that Berinsky has identified. So I think that's important to keep in mind.
Well, thank you. Both very good complementary points from both of you. I'm going to try and integrate a couple of the questions that have come in while we've been having this conversation with one of my own. And even though I work in Washington, D.C., and all I care about is public policy, at least that's what I'm told that I'm supposed to care about, I want to probe a little bit more just in terms of the findings of your research, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the implication side of things. So one question for Rory, one for Jen. For Rory, it would be, you found more discontented Chinese, with people who are discontent with the political system having a certain kind of psychological composition as opposed to those others. And is there a possibility that people started as relatively optimistic, happy, engaged, they got screwed by the system, their personality changed, and that just sort of the direction of causality, and that maybe what we consider when we talk about personality, at least as just a lay person, we tend to think of that as an enduring characteristic of ourselves. But maybe people just become grumpy because they've been kicked around. I don't know, just possible. I'm just wondering how you deal with that. I'm sure you've thought about that. And for Jen, one of the participants asks about studying abroad, because from their conversations with Chinese students, they know that some of them actually don't have very good experiences abroad. They have a sense of alienation or discrimination, and maybe that leads them to be more nationalistic. So can you say a little bit about their original preferences and maybe a little bit about what the experience of studying abroad how that may affect people? So why don't we start with Rory this time, and then we'll go to Jen.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would actually want to start with a quick caveat about my own findings, which is that my findings are about what I would call discontented citizens in China today. And by discontented, I mean people who say they don't like the government on a survey. And those people are quite different from the dissident community and other people I've mentioned. And so I wanted to be careful there and not speak with overly broad strokes. But in terms of your question, by the way, a very social science question, Scott Kennedy, you have your political scientist roots are showing. The direction of causality in this type of project is impossible to discern, but I think intuitively and from my own experience, I think it flows in both directions, right? So when you observe that people who are discontented they're introverted, fearful, anxious people, those traits are generally associated with difficulties integrating with society and succeeding socially and professionally. So you can see why that constellation of traits would lead someone down a path of being discontent. But you can also see why someone being discontent might actually affect the manifestation of their personality. And we know that personality is generally stable in the life course, but it can change. And so when you say a finding like Chinese citizens that are discontent are fearful and anxious, are they discontent because they're fearful and anxious, or are they anxious because they're discontent and have experienced, as you say, being knocked down along the road? I think it does go in both directions. And again, just drawing on my own experience, talking with people who have gone down kind of a more discontented path, they often will comment on social isolation, right? So once you start going down the path of critiquing the regime, maybe even engaging in some activism, you quickly become poisonous to those around you. And often that social isolation is self-imposed. People don't want to bring harm to their families and the people around them and their loved ones. But if you're in a society where everybody is affirming the system, or almost everybody is affirming the system, I think once you choose to go the opposite path, it can lead you to become more isolated. So I think the answer is in both directions. It's hard to prove.
On the question of college students in the US, the data that I showed you of college students the reason why we're collecting that data is precisely motivated by these anecdotal accounts of Chinese students in the US becoming more nationalistic, perhaps due to alienation or discrimination. So this is a sample of several hundred students across 60 universities all over the US, as well as several hundred students in China. We started surveying them before they started their fall of freshman year. Now they're in their junior year, and our goal is to keep surveying them until they graduate, precisely to see how are their preferences changing during this very formative time period. And what we see in that data is that the students who are coming to the US, the students who decide to study and go to college in the US, are at the onset much less nationalistic. But interestingly, so now we have data up to their junior year, their level of nationalism has not changed when we look at the average, and as well as the shape of the distribution. So that's at least some kind of larger sample size evidence that on the whole, Chinese students who come to the US are not becoming more nationalistic when they're in the US. And in fact, they're the ones who are least national or much less nationalistic than their peers at top university in China are the ones who are coming to study and go to college in the US. I think that then there's a question of where do we get these anecdotes? And there very well might be some subset of students that are becoming more nationalistic, but there might be others who are becoming less. And I think this relates to a point Rory mentioned, which is about who do we hear from and who speaks up. And it could be that we hear more of these anecdotes of nationalism because those are the students who are making their voices heard, more so than the others whose views on nationalism are not changing, or those who are becoming less nationalistic.
A couple more questions from the group, and I'm tweaking just slightly just to fit with the conversation we've had so far and where we're going. So you mentioned that public opinion in China matters, despite the fact that it's an authoritarian system. So two ways to look at this is, first of all, how does the Chinese government pay attention to or measure public opinion? They do surveys? Do they do focus groups? Are they just doing, data sweeping or scraping of WeChat? Are they good at what they do? Could these folks get a job at a good university because they're good social science researchers looking at public opinion? So we're curious, how do they, if they care about public opinion, how do they know about public opinion? And the second would be, how would this translate into their actions? It might be a caring authoritarianism where they're like, oh, opinions this way, we need to help people, make them more positive. But it could be the opposite. Oh, these people don't think the right way about Taiwan or Hong Kong or one country, two systems or whatever. And we need to change them or repress, right? So how does it then translate from they know what the opinions are and then they need to take action? Jen, why don't we start with you and then Rory?
Yeah, so I've done some research looking at propaganda departments in China. We've looked at some of the evaluation criteria, the performance evaluation criteria for propaganda departments. And one half, as you would expect, is their ability to shape public sentiment and public opinion. But the other half of the performance metric indicators are about understanding public sentiment and public opinion. And they use all of the things, Scott, that you mentioned, including surveys. They analyze social media. They do smaller group meetings with the public. In terms of how well trained they are, I'm sure my guess is that there's a lot of variation. We also do know that they work with trained social scientists at Chinese universities to conduct this research as well. So I would say the Chinese government pays a great deal of attention to public opinion, preferences, as well as sentiment. And so then how does this translate? And there's, and to Scott's question, does it constrain, or does it act as a constraint, or is it input into propaganda and measures the shape? And probably my guess is that it's both. I think there is evidence that public opinion in China acts as a constraint. There's been research on nationalism and foreign policy showing that this is the case. But in addition, you have other situations where there's not a clear path to changing a particular policy. Let's say on real estate tax, for example. There are different views among the public, and that's a time when local governments, for example, will want to know, where does the public stand? And they do other things like hold press conferences to share policy drafts. If you didn't want public input, you wouldn't take those actions. But I think it's also true that on the other hand, understanding public sentiment and public opinion is used to inform the actions of the propaganda department in their other half of their work in shaping and what the government calls guiding public opinion and managing public opinion.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with everything Jen said. And I think just for folks in the audience, I think it's important to remember and know that the Chinese government is an information-rich regime. This is a government that collects a lot of information on the population through surveys, but also through social media, through tracking of people. So in some sense, my guess is they actually have more data on people's opinions than they have technical capacity to process. In terms of when it matters and in what direction, when would the government be responsive to public opinion and when would it seek to guide it? I think there is, of course, this duality in the system. Just to borrow from my own research in an earlier stage of my career about, I used to study the Chinese legislative system. And one of the arguments I would try to make is that there's a bounded nature of representation in China, which is that the government will tend to respond on issues that are really not core to regime security and state stability. And in that system, it would be things like infrastructure projects or education or healthcare, sort of issues that are more in the realm of public good provision. But on issues that were core to state stability and core to the authoritarian system itself, like elections or censorship or something like Taiwan, that's when you would see a little bit more of a heavy hand in the propaganda state. And I think it's important, given the tenor of our conversation today, to remember that this is a government that is well-versed in the tools of political indoctrination and education. And certainly with what we see in Xinjiang, we know that when the government comes to view a population as problematic, not just an issue, but an actual whole population, they're very willing to engage in very heavy-handed repression and political education in order to align that population's views with the state. So it's important to remember that aspect of the system as well.
Let me ask a little bit about some more policy-related things sitting in Washington, D.C. Washington's trying to figure out how to interact with the Chinese, deal with this huge challenge of a growing, more powerful China on the global stage. And I guess a couple things fall from that. One conversation that we have in Washington sometimes is, a great firewall. If we didn't have the great firewall and Chinese were reading the New York Times, CNN, Politico, maybe Chinese versions of those, God, we'd have a much different range of opinion in China about their own system, about the world. We'd all be, reading from the same text, and we wouldn't have these differences between us. What is your thoughts about if China's information environment changed significantly? Would we see significant changes in the type of views that you've seen? Is that one thing that you would expect from your research, or if it's not, or just think about that out loud if it's not directly related? Second would be China's place in the world and what Chinese people want. Chinese people, I remember living in China in 1999 during the embassy bombing, and lots of folks in my neighborhood protesting, and down at the embassy in Beijing, and the sense of strong, virulent, angry nationalism. But you also hear about Chinese that want to have China's place in the global sunshine and win Nobel Prizes and Olympic gold medals and shop at the fanciest stores in Paris, New York, in Beijing, in Hong Kong. China is now seemingly aligning itself with Putin and not with the West. And so I'm wondering, sort of in Chinese average person's sense of where the country fits in the world, is Xi Jinping potentially taking China toward a direction internationally, which might run into some obstacles in terms of some parts of public opinion in China. So the first about the information environment in China, and the second about sort of China's place in the world in public opinion. Rory, and then Jen.
Those are great questions. With respect to the first, I think this idea that if only Chinese citizens had access to unfettered media, they would become more liberal and therefore kind of more pro-democracy, and we'd gradually observe a shifting of constellation of public opinion. I think that's wishful thinking. There's a good deal of research that shows that this isn't the case. Molly Roberts, our friend and colleague, has shown in her book Censored that it doesn't take much to block people in terms of it's easy to get around the Great Firewall, in fact, but all it takes is a very small barrier to prevent people from accessing that type of information. And the second finding, I think someone in our Q&A highlighted it. There's a wonderful paper by Chen and Yang that looks at, actually randomly gave people VPNs in an experimental setting, and they observed, which is, we can talk about the ethics of that research, but they observed that by and large, people actually don't go seek out counter-attitudinal kind of information. So even if they had full access to the New York Times, Chinese or whatever it was, I don't think you would observe large readership of that type of outlet. In my own research, I've found that actually, when given the choice, Chinese citizens will gravitate towards state-owned media relative to Western media, which they perceive as biased against China. And so, and conversely, they believe that state-owned media are more pro-China, and that is a good thing. And so I don't think it's the case that you would observe a massive change in media consumption and therefore political attitudes, given that people tend to seek information that confirms their pre-existing beliefs. That's just a human tendency. With respect to the second question on sort of the direction of China and where Xi Jinping is taking it, I want Jen to weigh on this, so I'll get out of the way as fast as I can. But my own interpretation of my own data, and certainly what I see in Jen and Yiqing's work, is that I don't quite see the domestic political calculation that would lead China to a highly aggressive military posture with respect to Taiwan, right? So there's a narrative in DC that invasion of Taiwan is imminent and inevitable. From my perspective, and this is controversial, from my perspective, the CCP and Xi Jinping in particular are doing very well. They have high levels of support. There doesn't seem to be a major public opinion in favor of aggressive military action. And so if you're doing well and you're succeeding in staying in power, why would you risk that sort of military escalation? Now, what happens in Ukraine will have an effect, and it might send some message to Xi Jinping that he can get away with more than he thought, and I think resolve on part of the international community will matter. But I have never really seen the domestic politics argument for why it would be in the interests of the CCP to engage in that type of behavior. Now, legacy is a different issue, and it might be the case that Xi Jinping views this as part of his personal legacy as the great leader of the CCP. And so that might be part of it, and that would be what ultimately leads towards that calculation. But in terms of the public opinion data, what I see is a regime that's very successful, very well supported, and has no need to engage in that sort of foreign policy. But I'm curious to see what Jen has to say.
Yeah, I'll start in the reverse order. So I totally agree with Rory on the second point. And based on the work that we've been doing in public opinion, one question that we asked of the college students in our sample is, what are the criteria against which you would judge a country and want to be a citizen of a country? And the factors that come on top are relatively high living standards, economic growth, and happiness. None of those things have anything to do with China on the global stage or kind of international position and sovereignty, etc. So if we ask our respondents what kind of political system what kind of country they want to live in. It's really about the domestic conditions that they face, not about what's going on outside of China. That said, I think the Chinese government has been incredibly successful in perpetuating this narrative of China's century of humiliation and this idea that the West cannot tolerate the rise of China. And so if in the success of that narrative, then if people perceive economic growth as being tied to China, China's position on the foreign stage, then potentially that's where foreign policy could come in. But really fundamentally, our respondents that we've reached care about what's happening in China. To the first question, let's just release all censorship, not just get rid of the Great Firewall, but let's get rid of domestic censorship as well. What would happen? I think in the short term, it's exactly what Rory described. There's a ton of research showing that because people don't know what they're missing, if you got rid of the firewall, they're not going to go outside and consume. But that same research also shows that if you give people a taste of the New York Times and information that they are not consuming in China, that changes their behavior over the longer term. So I think there's the open question of what will happen in the longer term if there is no more external Great Wall censorship as well as domestic censorship. And you could think that there might be changes both in terms of voices that have been previously silenced on domestic Chinese media coming back if they feel safe to do so. Again, in the short term, I don't think they would, even if you got rid of the censorship because of fear and other things at work, but maybe over the longer term, as well as potentially changes to China's domestic media system. So if we look back 15 years, there was emerging commercialized media that was more independent. That is gone today. But if censorship were removed again, would those media outlets come back, those domestic Chinese media outlets come back and become a competitor against state media outlets? So I think those are things definitely for the longer term, and those are open questions as to whether removing censorship would change that broader ecosystem and environment.
That's really interesting because, and I think by delineating between short and long term, you squared the circle with Rory, and both what you say matters. And I could, one of the things that popped out to me while you were speaking, Rory, before, and you as well, was I was just thinking about American consumers' media tastes and habits, and the gravitation towards media that confirms your opinions. And so you see that in what people have in their Facebook feeds or other types of things that they consume. Some people will read the New York Times and CNN, and other people will not. They will go to Fox or something else or other things. And we all don't watch Walter Cronkite at night any longer, or whoever was the Xinwen Lianbo, the American national news. And so there is this fragmentation of media, which may be about sort of feeding you what you like and what you're most comfortable as well. It may not. So what you're seeing may not just be a Chinese phenomena. It may be just something that we're seeing more generally. So let me turn and see a couple more questions that we have here before I hand things back to Anjali. And one question that came in has to do with, again, with preferences for state-owned media and whether that university students who travel abroad, when they're in the United States or abroad, go back and look at at Chinese state-owned media. One of the conversations in DC we have is should we ban access to WeChat in the United States because it gives Chinese state media direct access to students here who we want to actually be, consuming our news. I was wondering if Jen or Rory, you have thoughts about that.
One of the things we've been looking at is these students' consumption of media, what media they consume. So we do absolutely find that the students who are in the US consume US and other Western-based media. We also find that they do use WeChat. So it's true that if you ban WeChat, you would ban access to state media and state accounts, but you would also be getting rid of discussion groups that are of like-minded Chinese nationals at the same time. because there's so much happening on that platform. So I think the idea of a ban could be appealing for some purposes, but it also might backfire in a lot of other ways.
Roy?
Yeah, I haven't seen I saw the question in the chat. One thing I recall, I had a colleague, Cho-Ching Tai, who wrote her dissertation on the experience of coming abroad to the United States for Chinese students. And this was 10 years ago now, so it might be a bit dated. But her general point of view was that people would come and then somewhere in their first or second year, they would have this sort of epiphany where they would be exposed to a lot of new information, especially about Chinese history that they hadn't seen when they were in China. So that was an initial experience. And then shortly thereafter, they would come to better understand some of the issues with American society and the American political system. And they would also observe an increasingly salient anti-China bias and anti-Chinese bias. And so there'd almost be sort of an arc to their change in political attitudes, where there would first be sort of an awakening, and then a defensiveness and an appreciation actually for the Chinese political system relative to the United States. And I don't know if that holds true, Jen, in your data. But I think my overarching takeaway is that I think educational exchange is extremely valuable, and I think we need to be protecting our Chinese students, and it's a difficult time to be Chinese in the United States right now. And so I'm not generally in support of policies that are impinging on any of their freedoms, including their ability to consume whatever media they choose. But I also think we need to. I believe in educational exchange, but I also think we shouldn't be naive that this is going to be a process where we create a bunch of future Democrats that are going to go back and liberalize China, because I haven't seen all that much in the data I've looked at. Although, Jen, I'm curious to hear your reactions.
Just on that point, I mean, our students are at the end of their junior year, toward the end of their junior year. So there's still time for change. But what we've observed is that Chinese students who come to the US do not become more nationalistic. It's very, very clear. Their underlying preferences are not changing, even in the last 2 years, which have been incredibly
They don't become more
tumultuous,
nationalistic.
Right? They do not become more nationalistic.
Okay.
They're less nationalistic at the beginning, and when they come to the US, and they are absolutely not becoming more nationalistic when they're in the US, despite the last 2 years of COVID and with anti-Asian rise of anti-Asian actions in the US. We haven't observed that change, which anecdotally people are expecting. We'll continue to gather this data for the next year or two, and so we'll see what happens. But to date, we have not found at all that to be the case, that students who are in the U.S. are becoming more nationalistic.
Let me ask one final question, which you began to hint at here, which is just if both of you would just tell us what's one project that you're working on right now, so that when we can come back and invite you for another event in a couple of years after your work has been done and published, what's the big question out there that you've not answered, that you're trying to answer now, that we can look forward to? Jen?
Oh, the big question. I think a lot of our work is continuing in this area of public opinion and ideology, and I think I've already spoken about some things that are continuing. Another area of my research that's a little bit separate is on censorship and propaganda, and we have big projects looking at how Chinese government propaganda is changing with digital media. And so one project that we're in the midst of right now is looking at government presence on Douyin, so the Chinese branding for TikTok, how they're using the platform to message the public, and how that looks quite different than what we usually think of as traditional propaganda.
Roy?
I'm working on a book. It's a political science book, so I wouldn't wish it on anybody, but hopefully it will come out in a year or two. And it's called The Party Is Me, and it's about the psychology, kind of the psychological mechanisms underlying support for authoritarian rule, and to try and go into some of the themes we talked about today. So what types of citizens come to internalize the regime as part of their self-concept and come to support the system, and what types of citizens reject it. So that's the broader question for my research.
Terrific. Well, another way to look at the question of authoritarian resilience in ways different than others before. You both have made my job really easy. I appreciate it. Your work's fantastic. You are both really rising rock stars in the field, models for others doing great research, great teaching as well. And we look forward to continuing to learn from both of you in the years ahead. I'm going to turn things back over to Anjali and the Asia Society and want to thank them for giving me this chance to moderate today's conversation.
Thank you so much, Scott. That was such an interesting conversation. We really appreciate you both, Jen and Rory, coming and sharing your research with us. And we want to thank again Stanford for partnering with us, Sky, on this new collaborative endeavor. So this will be the first of many to come. So many questions actually kept coming through the chat box. So I think we've definitely hit a home run here. I'd also like to thank the audience for tuning in and encourage folks to consider becoming a member of Asia Society. You can visit asiasociety.org/memberLA or make a donation at asiasociety.org/donatela. We make these programs free and available to the public and appreciate your support and are allowing us to continue to be able to do that. So thanks everyone for participating in our conversation today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you. Goodbye.